The first time Liana ever noticed Aiden, it wasn't because of anything dramatic. No dazzling entrance, no cinematic slow-motion moment. He was just leaning against the side of the campus library, half absorbed in a sketchbook, tapping his pencil against the edge as if lost somewhere far away. It was autumn, and leaves swirled across the courtyard in lazy spirals, gold and rust and orange catching in his messy hair. Liana had been on her way to a late afternoon study session, clutching her laptop against her chest, when her eyes drifted across him. She hadn't meant to stare, but there was something magnetic in the way he seemed untouched by everything around him, like he existed in his own orbit. Liana wasn't the type who usually noticed boys in that way. Her life at university was a schedule carved into stone: classes, library, dance practice, back to her small dorm. Friends often teased her about being too serious, too focused, too unwilling to let life spill into her carefully drawn lines. She liked it that way. It made her feel safe. But something about the boy with the sketchbook made her pause for the first time in a long time. She lingered, just for a heartbeat longer than she should have, before forcing her steps forward. Later that night, she couldn't concentrate. The lines of her textbook blurred, her eyes unfocused. She caught herself wondering what he had been sketching, whether his eyes were as calm as they had seemed from a distance. She shook her head, chastising herself, as if her mind had slipped somewhere it didn't belong. The following week, fate, or coincidence, or whatever name people gave to the small tricks of the universe, decided she hadn't seen enough. The same boy sat 2 rows ahead of her in an art appreciation lecture she rarely paid attention to. She had enrolled because her roommate convinced her it was an easy credit, but now she found herself scanning the room each day, catching the curve of his jaw when he leaned to write, the way his hands moved when he explained something to the girl beside him. She never caught his name in those early weeks. It remained an unanswered question that hummed at the edge of her curiosity. It wasn't until the midterm break that the universe pushed harder. The campus cafe was unusually crowded, rain forcing everyone inside, voices overlapping in a messy symphony. Liana had squeezed into a corner with her coffee when suddenly someone asked, "Is this seat taken?" She looked up and there he was, closer than she'd ever seen, every detail sharp now. The flecks of green in his hazel eyes, the faint smudge of pencil on his fingers. No, she stammered, cursing herself for sounding awkward. "Thanks," he said, sliding into the seat opposite her. He opened his sketchbook without hesitation, as though this was the most natural thing in the world. For a few minutes, silence hovered. Liana sipped her coffee, pretending to read, though her eyes kept flicking up. Finally, curiosity overcame her. "Do you always draw in the middle of chaos?" she asked, her voice softer than she intended. His eyes lifted, catching hers with quiet amusement. "Chaos makes people interesting. It's easier to see them when they're not pretending to be still." Something in the way he said it made her shiver, though the cafe was warm. "And what do you see when people are still?" His smile tilted, almost secretive. "I'm not sure. Maybe that's why I keep drawing." That was their first conversation. Small, almost fragile, but it stuck. She learned his name, Aiden, and that he was majoring in architecture but spent half his free time sketching everything that wasn't buildings. She also learned that once Aiden decided to sit with someone, he didn't drift away easily. Over the next weeks, he appeared in small ways, waiting outside the lecture hall with a crooked grin, offering her the last pastry from the cafe line, once even walking her back to her dorm through a drizzle just because umbrellas are more interesting when shared. Liana found herself laughing more around him than she had in months. He teased her seriousness, nudging her to loosen the rigid edges of her world. "You live like your calendar is a set of prison bars," he joked once. And though she rolled her eyes, she knew he was right. Aiden, by contrast, lived as though time bent around him, as though rules were suggestions rather than commands. It terrified her and fascinated her at once. But the line between fascination and fear blurred the night of the winter festival. Campus lit up with strings of fairy lights, stalls selling hot chocolate and roasted chestnuts, music carrying across the chilled air. Liana had gone reluctantly with her roommate, determined to stay only long enough to be polite. Yet there he was again, leaning near a booth where lanterns floated upward, his eyes catching the glow. "You came," he said, surprised but pleased. "I don't usually," she admitted. "Crowds aren't my thing." "Then maybe you need someone to make them less of a crowd," he replied, offering his hand. It wasn't quite an invitation, not quite a command, but something in his voice drew her forward. She took his hand, surprised at the steadiness in his touch. They wandered through the festival together, sampling food, laughing at clumsy street performers, stopping to watch fireworks explode above the dark sky. At one point, as the crowd surged around them, he leaned closer and said, "You're easier to draw in my head now." Her laugh caught in her throat. "You've been drawing me?" "Since the day by the library," he admitted without shame. "You stood there like the world was rushing around you, but you weren't moving. I thought, maybe I should keep that." She didn't know how to respond. No one had ever seen her like that before. And yet, in that moment, she realized she didn't mind being seen by him. As weeks melted into months, their connection deepened, though neither of them named it outright. They studied together, often in silence, their presence enough. They took late-night walks when the campus was hushed, words spilling more easily in the dark. Aiden showed her sketches that captured fleeting pieces of her, her hands curled around a mug, the slope of her shoulder when she bent over her notes, the quiet curve of her smile when she thought no one noticed. Liana, in turn, began to share the parts of herself she usually buried. She spoke of her childhood in a small town where dreams felt too big for the streets she grew up on. She confessed how terrified she was of failure, how she clung to control because the unknown felt like falling. Aiden listened, not judging, sometimes offering nothing more than silence and his steady gaze. And then came the night everything shifted. It was raining again, harder this time, and they had taken shelter under the eaves of an old brick building. Liana was shivering, her hair plastered to her cheeks, when Aiden shrugged off his jacket and draped it over her shoulders. She looked up at him, ready to thank him, but the words stuck. His eyes were different, softer, almost vulnerable, as if waiting for something. The rain roared, drowning the world, and in that suspended moment, he leaned down and kissed her. It wasn't like the movies. There were no fireworks, no perfectly timed music. It was clumsy, wet with rain, his hair dripping against her forehead. But it was real, startlingly real, and her heart pounded so violently she thought it might break free from her chest. When he pulled back, his voice was barely audible. "I've wanted to do that since the lanterns," she swallowed, unable to steady her breath. "Why did you wait?" "Because you don't rush masterpieces," he said simply, as if it was the most obvious thing in the world. From that night on, everything was different. They were no longer just two students passing each other in the chaos of campus life. They were something more, something fragile and fierce at once. They stole moments between classes, lingered over late-night conversations, found excuses to touch in the smallest ways, a brush of fingers, a hand at her back, a whispered joke shared too close. But even as the warmth between them grew, shadows lingered. Liana's structured world began to collide with Aiden's unpredictable one. He missed deadlines, forgot meetings, lived as if tomorrow would always forgive today. She tried to pull him into her order, and he tried to pull her into his freedom. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes it cracked. One evening, after a fight about something as small as a missed dinner, she sat alone in her edge of a blade, exhilarating and terrifying at once. She didn't know the answer. But when her phone buzzed with his message, "Meet me where we first talked." "I'll wait as long as it takes," her heart answered for her. She went. Of course she went. And as she walked into the cafe where it had all begun, she knew this was only the beginning of something neither of them could control, something that would test everything she thought she knew about love, about risk, about herself. The air inside the cabin that night was heavy with unsaid words. Emma lay in the loft bed, staring up at the low wooden ceiling, listening to the crackle of the dying fire downstairs. Every creak of the old cabin seemed to echo her heartbeat, restless and uneven. Lucas was somewhere below on the pull-out couch. and the silence between them stretched wide, like a river they were both too afraid to cross. The next morning, the lake was still wrapped in mist, silver light spilling over the glassy water. Emma padded down barefoot, finding Lucas already sitting at the dock, his legs dangling over the edge, a fishing line cast lazily but clearly forgotten. He didn't notice her at first. His shoulders were slouched, his gaze lost in the ripples, and she realized he wasn't fishing at all. He was thinking. Couldn't sleep? She asked softly. Lucas startled, then shook his head with a half-smile. Not really. Too many thoughts. Emma sat beside him, pulling her knees to her chest. For a long while, neither of them spoke. The world around them seemed to demand silence. The gentle lap of water, the occasional bird call, the hush of the wind in the pines. Finally, Lucas turned his head toward her. What if we're making the wrong choices? About college, about everything. Her chest tightened. She wanted to tell him she'd been asking herself the same thing, that the idea of leaving him behind felt like tearing out a part of herself. But the words tangled on her tongue. Maybe there isn't a wrong choice, she managed. Maybe it's just about what we're brave enough to fight for. His eyes softened, the way they always did when he looked at her, like he saw more than she ever admitted. And what are you brave enough for? She held his gaze, pulse racing. The confession trembled just behind her lips. You. Always you. But instead she looked away, breaking the moment. For figuring it out as I go. The rest of the weekend passed in a blur of near confessions and careful silences. They cooked marshmallows by the fire, played old card games, even swam in the icy lake. From the outside, anyone would have thought they were just two best friends soaking up one last summer together. But underneath, everything pulsed with tension. Every glance lasted too long. Every brush of skin sparked something neither dared name. On the drive back, the Jeep's radio filled the quiet with pop songs. Emma stared out the window, watching the scenery whip by, her mind replaying every almost moment of the weekend. When Lucas finally dropped her off at her house, he leaned against the steering wheel, hesitating. "I'll see you tomorrow?" he asked. "Of course," she said, though her throat ached. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Good night, Em." That night, Emma cried quietly into her pillow, not knowing why. Maybe it was the weight of growing up. Maybe it was the fear of losing him. Or maybe it was the simple truth she still couldn't say out loud. The weeks slipped by, each one pulling them closer to the inevitable goodbye. Graduation came with its blur of caps and gowns, the swell of music, the roar of cheers from parents in the bleachers. Emma's family waved wildly from the stands, her little sister shouting her name while Lucas stood tall beside her, tassels swaying in the breeze. When the ceremony ended, they found each other in the chaos. Hugging so tightly, Emma thought she might never let go. "We did it," she whispered, blinking back tears. "Yeah," he said, holding her just as hard. "But it feels like everything's just starting." Summer melted into a series of last times, last bonfire with their friends, last late-night drive through the city, last visit to the diner where they'd ordered fries since middle school. Every moment felt like it carried a secret countdown, ticking toward August. One night, under a sky littered with stars, Emma finally broke. They were lying on the hood of Lucas's Jeep, shoulders pressed together, the air warm with crickets singing all around. "Lucas," she said, her voice trembling. "I'm scared." He turned his head toward her, eyes searching. "Of what?" "Of leaving. Of not knowing who will be without this." She gestured between them, a fragile motion. "Without us." For a moment, he didn't answer. His hand twitched on the metal, inches from hers. Then, slowly, he covered her hand with his. His palm was warm, steady, grounding. "Him," he said softly. "We've been us our whole lives. That doesn't just disappear, no matter where we go." Her throat ached, tears blurring the stars. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to trust that friendship, or love, or whatever this was, could stretch across miles. But a part of her feared the truth. Distance changes everything. When he squeezed her hand, she turned her face away so he wouldn't see her cry. The last week of summer came like a storm. Suitcases lined Emma's room, boxes stacked high with pieces of her life. She folded clothes with mechanical motions, each one reminding her of the girl she'd been and the girl she was about to become. On the final night before her flight, Lucas showed up at her door. He didn't say anything at first, just pulled her into a hug that felt like both a promise and a goodbye. "Come with me," he said suddenly. Emma blinked. "Where?" "Just come." They drove without speaking, the Jeep rumbling down back roads until they reached the old lookout point above the city. The town below glowed like a sea of fireflies, familiar and small. "I wanted to see this with you one last time," Lucas said quietly. Emma swallowed hard, every nerve buzzing. "It won't be the last," she whispered. He looked at her then, really looked at her as if memorizing her face. His jaw tightened, his eyes shining with everything he hadn't said. And before she could second guess, he leaned in. The kiss was soft, almost tentative, but it carried the weight of years. Years of laughter, secrets, fights, loyalty, and unspoken love. Emma froze for a heartbeat, then melted into him, her hand finding his cheek. The world tilted, every fear and every hope colliding in that single moment. When they finally pulled apart, breathless, neither spoke. The silence was filled with too much, relief, shock, longing. But she pressed a finger to his lips, shaking her head. "Don't, not tonight, just let this be ours." He nodded, and they stayed there until the first light of dawn painted the sky. The goodbye at the airport was brutal. Families bustled around them, announcements echoed over loudspeakers, and Emma clung to Lucas like she was drowning. "Promise me," she whispered. "Promise you what?" His voice cracked. "That we'll find our way back. No matter what." He cupped her face, eyes fierce with emotion. "I promise." She kissed him again, desperate and trembling, before finally pulling away and walking toward security. With every step, the space between them grew until he was just a figure behind glass, waving, his eyes locked on hers until she disappeared from sight. Months passed. College was everything and nothing Emma had imagined. California was warm and buzzing with new people, new classes, new experiences. She smiled, she laughed, she even started to feel like she belonged. But every night, when the world quieted, she thought of him. Lucas called, they texted, they sent each other pictures of their new lives. But time zones and schedules tangled their connection, and sometimes days passed in silence. Emma told herself it was normal, that they were both just busy. But doubt crept in like shadows at the edge of her heart. One late October night, as rain pattered against her dorm window, her phone buzzed. Lucas's name lit up the screen. "Hey," she answered, trying to sound cheerful. "Hey." His voice was tired, frayed. "What's wrong?" she asked immediately, a pause. Then, "I miss you, Em, so much it hurts." Her eyes stung. "I miss you too." "I don't know if I can do this," he admitted. "Pretend like it's easy. Like we're not." Breaking, her heart clenched. "Lucas." "I love you," he blurted, the words rushing out like he couldn't hold them anymore. "I've loved you forever. And I don't care about the distance or the plans or any of it. I need you to know." Tears spilled down her cheeks. She pressed the phone tighter to her ear, wishing she could reach across the miles. "I love you too," she whispered, voice shaking. "I think I always have." For a long moment, neither spoke, just breathed into the connection that spanned states. And though the miles still stretched between them, Emma felt something shift, a thread tying them tighter, unbreakable. The months ahead weren't easy. There were still missed calls, late-night tears, and the ache of distance. But there was also laughter, shared dreams, and the certainty of love that had finally been named. By the time summer rolled around again, Emma stepped off a plane and saw Lucas waiting for her at the gate, flowers in hand and that same familiar smile lighting his face. She dropped her bag and ran into his arms, and in that moment, every mile, every doubt, every fear fell away, because some stories aren't about choosing the perfect path. They're about choosing each other, again and again. No matter where